Mr. Majewski's Anatomy 32 class lecture, Chapter 21, Part 2, Vision. So, let's start with the accessory structures associated with our optical sense. We have the eyelashes and the eyebrow. These are extra little bits of hair, the purpose of which is to try to keep things from falling in your eye, although it seems to me it's the eyelash that's going to fall in the eye more often than anything else. You have the eyelids themselves, both an upper eyelid that's moved by the levator palpebri superioris muscle and a lower eyelid. There's the palpebral fissure, that's the actual line between your upper and lower eyelid, which obviously that fissure can get wider or narrow depending on if your eyes are open or not. And then you have a lateral and medial commissure, which is just the corners of the eye. And in the medial commissure, you'll find the lacrimal caruncle, which is basically the opening to the lacrimal sac. So, which cranial nerve innervates levator palpebri superioris muscle? Why, it's good old oculomotor nerve 3. It is busy causing lots of muscles around the eye to contract. So, what happens? Well, you got the lacrimal gland on your lateral side above your eyeball, and it will release tears through the lacrimal duct that'll fill in the whole fissure area, and then it'll enter the lacrimal canals to reach the lacrimal sac, and then carry the tears eventually through the nasolacrimal duct to the nasal cavity. So that's the route tears take to go from your eye to your nasal cavity. And within the lacrimal fluid, the tears, is basically just water, some mucus, salts, and lysozyme. Lysozyme, again, is an antibacterial type substance. So now let's look at the eyeball itself. Well, it turns out the eyeball is consisted of 3 layers. The outermost layer is referred to as the fibrous tunic. The outermost layer of the eyeball includes the sclera, that's the white of the eye, the white portion of the eyeball, as well as the cornea. The cornea is also part of the fibrous tunic, and it is a dome-like transparent portion that is in front of the iris and pupil. And then there's also the sclerovenous sinus. So that is basically an area that allows for fluids to leave the front cavity or anterior cavity of the eye, and this would be in front of the iris, and you can see it here. It's sort of like the border between the sclera and the cornea. Then you have the second layer. The second layer is called the vascular tunic, and it is composed of a few different structures. You've got the choroid. The choroid is basically on this dark reddish sort of structure. That's sort of the middle layer of the back of the eye, and it is highly vascularized, so it carries a lot of blood vessels to nourish the eyeball. You'll find near the front you have the ciliary body. The ciliary body is sort of the anterior portion of the vascular tunic, and it has the folded structures called the ciliary processes, and they have zonular fibers that extend from them to the lens itself. So here would be the ciliary processes and those fibers extending to the lens itself. And so they are involved in actually controlling the shape of the lens so that you can focus on things near or far. And specifically the ciliary muscles are what control that. And these ciliary muscles, their border with the choroid within the vascular tunic is referred to as the ora serrata retinae. Then you have the iris. The iris is the colored portion of the eye, whether it's blue or brown or whatever. It's sort of a flattened donut with a hole in the center, and the center hole is referred to as the pupil. And so the important thing of the iris is that it causes, it's made of smooth muscles, and it will contract or relax, basically to cause the pupil to contract or dilate. So you got muscles important for each. The innermost muscles around the pupil itself is the sphincter pupillae muscles that will cause it partially to contract, and then you have the dilator pupillae muscles on the outside that when they contract will actually help pull the pupil open even further and dilate it more. The third layer of the eyeball is the retina. On this one, it's sort of, I guess, a yellowish color. This is where we're actually going to be able to detect light. And it is composed of two layers of its own. The superficial layer is the pigment layer, and then the more deep layer that's lying next to the choroid is the neural layer. So you have the neural layer and I said that backwards. The pigment layer is the layer lying next to the choroid, and the neural layer is the one lying next to the vitreous chamber. So let's look at that. Here's the pigment layer, and on top of that is all these nerves that then open up to the vitreous chamber. So you got a small pigment layer and a large neural layer. The neural layer itself is also layered. It's composed of a number of different kinds of cells. So you've got the photoreceptors, which are actually facing away from where the light is entering the layer. And so you get the rods and the cones, cones, and the rods detect dim light, but they cannot detect color, and the cones detect bright light, and they also can distinguish between colors. And so within them you have three main segments. You've got the outer segment that detects the light, the actual sensory portion. You have the inner section, that is the metabolic machinery. It's going to have the nucleus, mitochondria, all that sort of stuff. And then you have the synaptic terminals, which will then synapse with the first order sensory neurons or other neurons. There are a number of different neurons found in the eyeball that are interacting with our photoreceptors. And as you can see here in this image, you have light entering the tissue of the back of the eyeball, and it actually has to go through all these neurons before it actually makes it to where the receptors are, which just goes to show that our eyeballs are actually made kind of backwards. Alright, after that, you have a number of neurons that will synapse with the photoreceptors. These include the bipolar cell layer, which is going to transmit the signal onto other neurons. And then the ganglion cell layer, which will continue sending the signal out through the optic nerve. So it's the ganglion cells, axons, that form the optic nerve. And so again, as I said before, our neural layer is set up sort of backwards. So we have the receptors deep to where the light's coming in, and then we have the neurons on top of that, which means that we end up with a blind spot. And this is basically a spot in our field of vision where we can't see anything. But because our brain sort of compensates for that, it's difficult to actually realize that you have a blind spot. Alright, a couple of other interesting features on the retina is the macula lutea, which is the visual axis of the eye. So when light comes in through the pupil, directly opposite of it would be the macula lutea, where you get the absolute best reception of and resolution of visual impulses. Not impulses, of basically the signal is best at the macula lutea, so that you're able to really see well at that one spot. And because of that, you have at the center of that the fovea centralis, which is a depression. And in this depression you only have cones, because again the cones function much more superiorly to the rods and help us see color and things like that. Alright, now we're going to talk about the two main chambers of the eye. You have the anterior cavity. This is filled with clear aqueous fluid, and again it's produced by the ciliary bodies. It travels around the lens, goes past the irises to the anterior or front of the anterior cavity, and then eventually gets carried through the sclerovenous sinuses so that it is reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. Then the vitreous chamber is in the back of the eye, is behind the lens, and it is very big and is filled with the vitreous body, which is this big gelatinous mass that presses against and gives shape to the eye. Alright, so we now know about the eye and the receptors that detect it. Well, then now we get to see what happens to the signal as it leaves the eyeballs. Well, first of all, it leaves the back of the eye at the blind spot, and then it reaches this optic chiasm, which is sort of near the hypothalamus, right next to the pituitary gland. And here you have the medial portions of our visual field cross over, so that we have part of our right eye's vision going to the left side of the brain and part of our left eye's vision going to the right side of the brain. Really weird. So that is the optic chiasm. From here it enters the optic tracts, which are going to take the signal to the thalamus. Here, you will now have the signals interact and synapse with the third order sensory neurons, which are going to take the signal back to the back of the brain, because that's where our primary visual area is, in the occipital lobe of the cerebral cortex, which is pretty amazing. And as it's going that way, the nerve themselves is going to branch out into what's referred to as the optic radiation. So it's possible to have just one small portion of that damage, so that you only have a tiny portion of your field of vision no longer functioning. So disorders of vision, well, you can have cataracts. Cataracts is loss of transparency of the lens, which means that even though light goes through the pupil, it can't go through the lens and be focused. And it's possible now to replace that with an artificial lens. You can have glaucoma. Glaucoma is abnormally high intraocular pressure, basically the pressure within the vitreous chamber, that can lead to damage and eventual destruction of the neurons found in the retina. And this is actually the most common cause of blindness. And then there's age-related macular disease. This is a degenerative disorder of the retina and pigment layer. And so those cells eventually just die off over time. And it starts off at the macula luteus. So it's actually starting at where we can see the absolute best. And then it'll spread out so that the person may retain their peripheral vision but lose the ability to focus centrally. So here are some images. The first one is what things would look like to someone who has cataracts that aren't completely opaque but are basically lost some of their transparency. The middle, or B picture, is what it would look like if someone had glaucoma. Basically, they're losing the peripheral vision and eventually it'll all be gone. And then C is an example of someone with age-related macular degeneration, which in this case, they're losing the center of their field of vision and it'll spread out until they're completely blind. And that's it for vision. I hope it was as clear to you as it sounded to me.